Hey everybody! This week I'm bringing you what is, in my opinion, one of the very best venison recipes of all time. I'm making this gorgeous Swiss steak with a rich and oh so delicious gravy that everyone's gonna love. So let's get started. I'm gonna get started by prepping my vegetables, and everybody's got their own combination of vegetables that they like with this, but this is all I need for mine. And I've got a couple of medium onions. This is about a pound of button mushrooms, and if it's foraging season and you got some good wild mushrooms, now is the time to use them. I've got a cup of some kind of tomato product, either tomato sauce or diced tomatoes. This is some crushed tomato here, and a little bit of garlic. Now, I'm gonna slice these onions just into some thin kind of half rounds. And I'll also just slice those mushrooms kind of 1/4 inch thick or so. I will set these aside for the time being. And now I'll mince this garlic. And I'll set that aside as well. Now, let's get that meat ready. I've got some beautiful venison here from a black-tailed deer that I've cut into some pretty thick steaks. These are probably 1.25 inches, almost 1.5 inches thick. Now, there are countless recipes for Swiss steak. Every family's got their own, and that makes sense because Swissing has very little to do with ingredients, and the term actually comes from the fabric industry and has nothing to do with Switzerland at all. It's a method of pounding cloth to make it flat and smooth. So when you're Swissing steak, you're usually using a tougher cut of meat like some beef round and pounding it out to tenderize it and then smoothing it with a coating of flour. I'm using this great venison from last year's deer, and it's not particularly tough, so I'm not gonna have to pound my meat too aggressively. But if this were a tougher chunk of meat, I'd beat it like it owed me money. Now, you can pound your meat with one of those tenderizers, or you can use one of these guys. I often like to use a rubber mallet, but a lot of the time, I like to pound my meat with my fist. For this venison, I want it to stay pretty thick, so I'm not really gonna pound it down. I'll use this little guy and just break it up a little bit. But like I said, I'm not very concerned with the tenderness of this deer. I've taken care of it really well, and it's really nice and tender already. Now, after I've thoroughly beaten my meat, I'm gonna season it up a little, and I just like to use some salt and some pepper and some garlic powder. I will sprinkle that with some salt. And get nice and peppery, and we'll eat that with just a little garlic powder. And I'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. To finish this Swissing process, I'm gonna flour the meat, a little deer hair there, thoroughly, and I am really gonna work the flour into that. Push it in really firmly all over. Give that some, squeeze that, knead it in there. I really want that flour to be pounded into the surface of that meat. Now let's put some heat to the meat And I like to use a big, wide, shallow pan like this with a lid that's oven safe. That way I can do this all right in one pan. But if you don't have something like this, you can get it all prepped in a skillet and then put that into a casserole when you put it in the oven, and you're gonna do just fine. So I'm gonna heat this up to around medium heat, and I'm gonna put a generous amount of cooking oil in the bottom. So I want to make sure that it makes contact with the meat all around. There's no dry spots down in there. So that was probably close to a half cup in this big pot. But I'm going to end up draining a bunch of that off, so don't worry about it. You just want to make sure you got enough to get this job done. Now I'll check my oil. I'll just use one of these strips of onion and put it in there. Make sure I get a nice sizzle on it. And that looks pretty good. You don't want to crowd the pan, so make sure they're not touching each other. I'll just swirl that a little bit until the moisture comes off of the bottom. That's looking pretty nice and crusty right there. I'll flip it over. There's a lot of moisture on that other side there, so I'm gonna roll this around. Try to get a lot of that moisture to cook off, and that'll help to keep it from sticking. I'm gonna scrape that a little bit before I get my next batch going in. Get that nice and smooth again.
Oh no! Oh!
Now, I'm going to get rid of most of that oil. Just a little bit of oil left behind there. And now I'm going to get right in there with my onions and mushrooms. And I am going to be cooking these down for a little while here until those onions get nice and brown. I'm not going to fully caramelize these down, but I want some good color and get some nice sweetness out of there. I'm going to go ahead and bolster that with a couple of tablespoons of butter. And you can keep that heat up at kind of medium-high until a lot of the water cooks out of this. And then you want to cut it down to medium-low to finish browning them. There we go. Now a lot of the water's gone. And I'll just keep cooking this down for another 5 minutes or so. And you should be preheating your oven to 325 degrees right about now. If this starts to look dry or starts to get crispy or stick to the pan or anything, add some more butter in there, or maybe a nice dollop of some bacon fat. That would be real nice in here too. Now my onions are nice and soft and sweet. I'll go ahead and throw in that minced garlic now. We'll just cook that for a minute or so. Now that that garlic is warmed through, I can smell it. I'm going to bring the heat up again to around medium-high. And now I'm going to put in quite a healthy amount of sherry. That is about 1 cup of sherry. Sweet or dry. Now we'll continue to pick up all the nice stuff off the bottom of the pan. And I'm going to cook this sherry down until it's really nearly non-existent. Now that's going to add some nice richness and a little bit of sweetness to this. Really lovely stuff. Now that sherry's just about cooked away, concentrated that flavor way down. And I nearly forgot the bay leaf. Now this is a fresh bay leaf, really, really strong stuff, so I'm only going to put about half of that in there. If you're using a dry bay leaf, go ahead and throw the whole thing in there. Now let's come in with our tomato. Get that stirred in nice and thoroughly. Now it's at this point that if you're going to put this into a casserole, go ahead and transfer this mix into the casserole and spread it around nice and evenly. I'm just going to continue to use the pan here. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to nestle my venison steaks down in there. All those juices go in too, of course. Now I'm going to bring in some beef stock. I'm going to kind of spread it around here. And I'm just going to add in enough of this beef stock to bring the level of that liquid just almost to the surface of the meat. I want the top of the meat to be out of the liquid. Just a personal preference. And this is low sodium beef stock because this is going to cook down a little and I don't want it getting too salty, and we can adjust that at the end if we need to. We'll just get that and jostle that around. That looks pretty good right there. And finally, I've got a little bundle of some fresh thyme. I'm just going to put that right on top. I'll pull those stems out of there at the end. I don't need to bother with plucking off all these tiny little leaves. Now I'm going to cover this before I pop in the oven, and I want a really good seal on there, so I'm actually going to add a layer of foil on there. Of course, if you're doing this in a casserole, you're going to cover it with foil anyway, just to kind of get a better seal on that. And we'll pop the lid on there. Now I'm going to pop this into that 325 degree oven, and how long is this going to take to cook? Well, that depends on how thick and hard your meat is. Venison and some of the tougher cuts of beef are nice and tender when they're rare or medium rare, and then they get very, very tough until they cook long enough to start to break apart the muscle fibers and connective tissues. So you want to cook that venison either for a minute or for a day. And this is something you really don't have to worry much about overcooking. It's just going to get softer and softer, and it's going to be delicious regardless. So let me get this in the oven, and then I'll clean up this mess I've made around here. Well, I gave this a little fork test at about an hour and a half, and it wasn't quite where I wanted it, so I ended up cooking this for 2 hours and 15 minutes. But those are some pretty hefty chunks of meat in there. So now, let's take a look and see what we've got. Oh yeah, that looks just about perfect. And let me tell you, from the moment this thing goes into your oven, the smells coming off it are absolutely mouth-watering. You'll be drooling the whole time this thing is cooking. Now let's check and see how the sauce looks. It's thickened up pretty well from cooking down and from the flour on the bottom of that meat. And if it's too thick, you can add in a little bit more of that beef stock. If it's not thick enough, go ahead and cook that down on your stovetop for just a little bit until it's where you want it. Now let's get a little taste test going here. Oh, yes, the seasoning here is just about perfect. I can't wait to try this out. And now, we finally get to see how we did. Oh yeah, that comes apart real nice. I don't like it to be too soft, but it should be very tender. Got that on top of some nice sweet potato mash. Oh, check out that bite. Oh yeah. Friends, I wish you were here because I'm telling you, you are missing out. The meat is nice and fork tender, and black-tailed deer is one of my absolute favorite meats. And the gravy is so flavorful. It's sweet and savory. It's got tons of that umami flavor from the meat and from the mushrooms. The flour thickens it up and gives it a really nice and silky texture. And even though I drained off most of the fat, the butter I added in there and that sherry give this a wonderful richness. If you make this with a nice marbly piece of chuck, it's almost too rich. Almost. Oh, it's so good. So, whether you got some wild venison, or some elk, or some bear, or even a nice hunk of beef, give this one a try, and I know you're gonna love it. Thanks for watching. Chicago?